What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another episode of Is It Worth It?, where I talk about books across all genres, review them, and let you know which are worth your time. Today, I am psyched to talk about the biggest fantasy release, at least for me, in 2020, and that is Brandon Sanderson's latest addition to the Stormlight Archive, Rhythm of War. If you haven't read the first 3 novels of the Stormlight Archive, highly suggest doing so before listening to this review. If you're still here, you clearly know what the Stormlight Archive is. It's Brandon Sanderson's massive 10-book project in his cosmere. Brandon Sanderson is a master of world building. I dare say he is the master of world building in the fantasy genre, and Rhythm of War is no exception. This guy is so driven by structure that some of his novels even play out that way. The Stormlight Archive is certainly one of those book series that has a very structured balance in every single book, and Rhythm of War actually looks to break that for the first time. We get a glimpse of this in the first 200 pages, because the first 200 pages of a Stormlight Archive book, they're kind of boring, typically. Not bad, but compared to the climax and even the middle portions of the novel, the beginning of Sanderson's stories in this series don't really compare. That is not the case here. Each of these books is broken into 5 parts with interludes breaking them up. Part 1 is typically kind of boring, but part 1 for Rhythm of War is one of the best parts of any novel so far. It moves from page 1, and that is such a relief, especially when we consider that there's a 1-year time jump between books 3 and 4. We don't have to deal with the setup that kind of comes in the other books, which pretty much happen right after one another. The falling action from the climax of the previous novel is almost happening at the beginning of the next book, but here, we aren't given that. We are thrown into the mix. Because of the decision to create this 1-year time gap, we are given some new conflicts that we didn't necessarily see coming, specifically regarding two of our main characters. Their entire arcs are built around this conflict, and again, it's something that you wouldn't have seen coming in the first 3 novels, but it does seem pretty important heading into this story, and by the conclusion of the story, it turns out to be extremely important. Overall, I really like the direction that Sanderson took here, adding new elements to a story that we are growing more and more familiar with every chapter read. This new direction is extremely well executed, and it's Sanderson, so what do you expect, right? One thing the man also excels in is characterization. Sometimes to a fault. His books are long-winded, and sometimes we do get these unnecessary blocks, these unnecessary chapters, or at least they feel unnecessary at the time, but they're there to continue to build the character, and that is the case here as well. The characterization is on point. Because this is the 4th book in a series, he's able to give these characters new depth, especially related to relevant themes in today's society. There are things that I wouldn't have necessarily considered in book 1 or book 2 of a series. It's something a new author can't do when introducing a character without it feeling forced, but here it doesn't feel forced. That's not to say they'll please everybody. Some of the decisions he makes regarding these characters and their relation to modern elements is a risk, and some people aren't going to like it, but the risk paid off for me. Speaking of payoffs, again, Sanderson mastered a lot of different things. Payoffs are certainly one of them. He spends so much time developing concepts that when we hit those part 4 and part 5s of these novels, it really hits home, and the culmination of some of these sequences and storylines are absolutely epic in Rhythm of War. Sure, getting to that point takes a little bit of time, and we'll talk a little bit more on that later, but overall, the payoffs are worth it. Navani's story, for example, is one of these that falls into that category. But man, the story is so good. It's easily the strongest in the book. It does take a little while to get into, but once you're into it, it's great. Her antagonist, Rabboniel, is a fantastic antagonist, a new antagonist in the series. So again, Sanderson showing off his ability to introduce new characters that we end up caring about and rooting for despite their villainous situation. Their stance, I guess, in the conflict, the central conflict of the Stormlight Archive. Shallan and Adolin also have a really satisfying arc in this story too. They felt more like side characters in this book, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but the way their story plays out and where they are at the end of book 4 versus the beginning is, again, like Navani's story, very satisfying. Like I said though, these story elements take a little while to get into. These plots are not necessarily the most engaging from page 1. Well, more like page 200. Here, pages 1 to 200 very much feel like a climax of sorts. And then once we have to get into the new situations, things aren't necessarily as engrossing. Again, this is nothing new to you if you're on the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. Sanderson's known for this. He's known for these long-winded stories that very easily could be cut down by not just a few pages, a few hundred pages, but then the payoff wouldn't be as grand. To me, it's a bit of a pacing problem. The payoffs are so, they pack such a big punch compared to the middle of the story, particularly your parts 2 and 3. I think that this book could have easily been cut down by 300 pages and we would have had the best book in the Stormlight Archive so far. We're going to rank these babies in a minute, but there's just so many great parts of Rhythm of War, and there's also a lot of parts that were difficult to get through. Let me put it this way, if Sanderson would have opted to keep the pace of the first part of this story in parts 2 and 3, book would have been better for it. I don't know how exactly he would have done that, and I do think he tries at times with mixing in some of these smaller arcs that are more action-oriented, but I digress. He knows more than I do when it comes to how to do this stuff, so. I guess I just wish we would have seen certain characters a bit more and certain characters a bit less. Like I said, Navani, strongest arc of the story, and she's clearly the main character, but there are some elements that could have been cut. They sure help with the character building and they make the payoff that much stronger, but sacrificing other characters, like Dalinar for instance. Dalinar does a lot of standing around in this book and talking, and that's not him, especially when we consider Oathbringer and the climax of the Way of Kings. I mean, these are classic Dalinar situations that we are yearning for in Rhythm of War, and they're lacking here. Like, for the first time in 3,000 pages, I thought Dalinar was kind of dull. That's not what I wanted to feel. Audible check-in time. I'm not going to touch on this for a while because we have talked about these two narrators before in the Eye of the World review, but they're fantastic. It's the same narrators that do The Wheel of Time, and they're the best in the business. I don't just say that to say that. They are legitimately the best Audible narrators in the business. It's astounding the life they've been able to bring to Sanderson's novels. So is Rhythm of War worth it? I guess the bigger question is whether or not the Stormlight Archive is worth it, because if you've made it this far into the Stormlight Archive, then yeah, you're going to want to pick up Rhythm of War, obviously. Even if you might have found Oathbringer less than perfect compared to the first two, as I did, and again, we're going to talk about that in a second. Rhythm of War is very much worth it, and it continues the Stormlight Archive in a way that is new, that is fresh, unique, and also sets up a major conflict in Book 5, because remember, the Stormlight Archive, while projected to be 10 novels, is apparently split into really 2 series of 5. So we're almost getting a mini conclusion with Book 5 that Book 4 sets up extremely well, while also delivering on certain climaxes and conflicts and resolutions that typically aren't found in a lead up to a finale novel. If any of that made sense. I know that was a lot. As far as the various systems and languages and cultures and characterization in world building for fantasy goes, Sanderson is that this takes the cake in all of fantasy. The pacing's just a little bit too slow for me at times. Let me surmise here in that part 1 and part 5 are the best part 1 and part 5 of any of the novels so far. However, parts 2 through 4, they have their ups and downs. So get ready for the slog that is the middle of this book once you finish part 1, but also know that it comes for good reason, and the climax is very much worth it. To give you an idea of how I feel about the Stormlight Archive, I want to rank these novels because my peers who have also read this series have differing opinions from me. We kind of universally agree that Oathbringer is the weakest entry of the series. Oathbringer has an awesome backstory. We focus on Dalinar in this book, and Dalinar's backstory is not only heartbreaking, but it is eye-opening, and it gives us so much insight into the character that we've seen both in action and in political situations in books 1 and 2. Everything makes so much more sense after we get that perspective. The present story, however, is pretty slow, and it does work as a lead-up book to book 4. Once we get to the top 3, opinions are very different, depending on what you like as a fantasy reader. The second weakest link is, for me, Rhythm of War, and I had a tough time with that. I really wanted to rank it second, but I couldn't because of the pacing issues in parts 2 through 4, and the story itself was just slightly long. It could have been in that second spot given how great parts 1 and 5 are, and some of the parts in parts 2 through 4. It's not like parts 2 through 4 are terrible. There's highs and lows there. It's just the lows slightly outweighed the highs in that middle portion of the novel, which didn't allow me to rank it above Words of Radiance, which is my second ranked novel in the series. Words of Radiance is a nearly flawless sequel. It's incredibly well done. The only reason I don't have it ranked above The Way of Kings, the first novel in the series, as the pinnacle of the Stormlight Archive to this point, is because I personally just don't like Shallan's backstory as much as Kaladin's. I think if you flip those, if you like Shallan's backstory more, you'll probably like Words of Radiance the most in the series. Some people also complain that The Way of Kings is a little boring for the first 600 pages. I just disagree there. This was probably the quickest I was ever able to get into a fantasy series with The Way of Kings. Kaladin gripped me, and Dalinar gripped me from the very beginning of the novel. The magic system in play here is fantastic. There are some shocking twists that I thought Sanderson pulled off extremely well, present in those first 2 parts of the first book. And the climax of book 1 is arguably the best climax of any novel I've ever read. So that is the reason why I have Way of Kings ranked so high. But Words of Radiance is no slouch. They could have been flipped. And if somebody does that, I have no issue with it, because Words of Radiance is an astounding sequel, one of the best in the entire fantasy realm. And obviously Rhythm of War has moments that are better than any of the books so far. So I could see somebody ranking that second. I don't know about the best in the series. People that are saying Rhythm of War is the best one yet, but I could maybe see the second best. Well, I'm not going to rank the first 3 novels on the worthy meter since it's been so long since I read them. I did rank Rhythm of War, gave it an 81 on the worthy meter, so a really fantastic story overall. I think if I were to do The Way of Kings, that'd probably be in the low 90s, and Words of Radiance would be in the high 80s, and Oathbringer's likely somewhere in like the high 70s. So all of these books are extremely well done. This is fantasy at its best. If you're looking to get into a fantasy series and you're still with us here, I highly recommend it, for sure. Next week, we're talking the sequel to Memory called Empire, which dropped in March this year, A Desolation Called Peace. Really excited to talk about that book with you, and we will be doing so on another episode of Is It Worth It coming soon. So thanks a lot, guys. Keep reading, watching TV, doing all the things you love to do during quarantine. Let's get through this together with some more reviews And I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot and have a good one.